Hello, everyone. Wyatt Claypool here for Juno News. And at the start, I would like to thank Candace Malcolm and the Juno News team for having given me the opportunity to do this show for them. Hopefully, you guys in the audience find it both entertaining and informative. I genuinely think the Canadian mainstream media wants me to succeed here because on the very day I am shooting the first episode of this show, the Globe and Mail, the premier Liberal Party publication, put out the funniest article I have ever read in my entire life. I am not even sure what I hold in my hands right now is real or not. It feels like a Monty Python script from the 1970s that went missing and has only resurfaced now in the year 2025 and was accidentally published by the Globe and Mail editorial team. By the way, the Globe and Mail is like the intellectual liberal publication. It's for liberals who are like lawyers in finance, in business, who want to read a 3,000 word Andrew Coyne article about absolutely nothing published 3 weeks after it was actually relevant. This is not the Toronto Star. That is the publication for left wing activists. This is the publication for serious individuals with serious liberal opinions. I'm going to contrast that characterization with the headline here. Check this out. It is funny from the absolute start, and absolutely we will be reading through the entire thing. Judge halts deportation of non-binary American in landmark ruling after Trump's gender edicts. Written by Marie Wolfe. Okay, and this is the photo that goes along with it. Let's get into it because this is just the tip of the iceberg. It gets absolutely insane from here. A federal court justice has halted the deportation of a non-binary American in a ruling that criticized Ottawa's immigration department for not properly considering the situation of LGBTQ Americans since US President Donald Trump took office. I'm sorry, that is patently insane that we have a judge in Canada arguing that Canada's immigration department is too strict. It is too strict on the rules and is not being compassionate enough. We are a country that brought in 17,500 criminals over the last decade, people who had criminal records that we overlooked and allowed them to enter the country as either permanent residents or on other visas. They are criticizing the immigration department for being too strict because somebody who's broken the law, who's non-binary, was not allowed to stay because something Donald Trump. It gets sillier from here. So it says, going back to the article, Angel Jenkel, a 24-year-old multimedia artist from Minnesota who is engaged to a Canadian, can now remain in Canada while their case is judicially reviewed in a judgment that their lawyers hailed as precedent-setting. Immigration lawyers have been inundated with inquiries from LGBTQ Americans about how to emigrate to Canada since Mr. Trump took office, with many who have Canadian parents and grandparents applying for Canadian citizenships. What are they talking about? What? And by the way, I do not believe them for a second when they say they've been inundated with emails. They've probably gotten 2 emails. You are histrionic if you think, as somebody in the LGBTQ community, that you are unsafe in the United States. But this person is backed up by the Canadian government. They've been putting out these ridiculous warnings to gay and trans Canadians not to go to the US or go with extreme caution because of things like Ron DeSantis passing a bill where you can't teach gender theory in the classroom. Men can't compete in women's sports. Men can't go into women's prisons by identifying as a woman. This is stuff, and the article is going to get to it, that apparently makes it unsafe for not only gay Canadians, trans Canadians to go down to the US, but even for gay and trans people in the US to stay there. They must flee to Canada and they must be allowed to break immigration law. This person could just go over the border every 6 months and then come back over. But apparently, even that is too much of a risk. Somebody from the state of Minnesota, run by pro trans governor Tim Walz. The man is borderline a trans activist, and he is the governor of their state, a Democrat who was the vice presidential pick for Kamala Harris' presidential ticket. Yes, this person is at risk by returning. So let's go down here at the next line. Adrian Smith of Smith Immigration Law, a Toronto firm specializing in LGBTQ immigration, said the federal court justice stopped their client's removal from Canada in part because an immigration officer had failed to consider recent evidence about the conditions in the US for trans and non binary individuals when assessing the risk of being returned. Had failed to consider recent evidence. What evidence? They can say that Trump is like, I guess, not a trans activist in his demeanor towards the law, like most people aren't. That's not evidence that you cannot remain in the United States. But the article goes on in this one paragraph that's absolutely side-splittingly hilarious. It starts off saying, Justice Julie Blackhawk, the first Indigenous woman appointed to the federal court, I don't know why they needed to mention that, but apparently it was relevant, said the immigration officer who carried out Meeks Jenkel's pre-removal risk assessment approach was, quote, flawed and unreasonable, unquote, and relied on outdated briefing material that, quote, does not address current conditions for LGBTQ, non-binary, and transgender persons, unquote, in the US. And no, that was not me stuttering when I was reading that paragraph. That is actually what it says. It is not saying Miss Jenkels, it is MX Jenkels. This is why I say it feels like a Monty Python skit that I am reading. It feels like Monty Python and the Holy Grail's Knights Who Say Ni, but it's me. So we have me, Jenkels, being allowed to stay in Canada because an immigration officer didn't, I guess, detect that there's a risk of that if she goes back to the United States, that Donald Trump's going to try and throw her through a plate glass window, that someone's going to physically attack her for being non-binary in the United States, in a blue state, presumably from a blue city. Oh, it's so tiring. Again, this is a publication that intellectual liberals read. Okay, moving on to the next line here. Quote, the officer failed to consider recent evidence of the conditions that may have supported a reasonable fear of persecution, unquote, she said in her ruling, saying that Meeks Jenkel's deportation must be delayed. People facing deportation from Canada can request a pre-removal risk assessment by Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada before being sent back. They are generally allowed to stay if they are deemed to be at real risk of persecution or serious harm if they are deported. And as we read more into this article, you'll find out there's no risk at all. The judge is just such a left-wing activist that they probably wanted the headline. They wanted to seem as progressive as humanly possible, so they are letting this person stay in Canada on illegitimate grounds when, again, you can just go over the border and then go back. You are allowed to go from one side of the border to the other every 6 months in order to actually be allowed to stay in the country. I've done that before, having been in the US for a while, and then just going back over the border so I wouldn't run out of time, and they penalize you for overstaying your allowance to be there on a normal trip. But here's the next line. Again, Mix Jenkel, who came to Ontario in 2022 as a visitor, represented themselves at the risk assessment and was denied the right to remain in Canada. Okay, so they were given a proper hearing and then they were denied because their application is absolutely ridiculous. But the article goes on to say they were due to be deported after failing to get the required documentation to stay in Canada with their partner, a social media influencer whom they are now engaged to marry. If you're failing to be able to get the proper documentation to stay in Canada, you suck at this because it is so easy to stay in Canada based on how wrecked our current immigration system is. But again, the article goes on to say, Mix Jenkel told the Globe and Mail that the current climate in the US is quote unquote scary and that being non binary there, they are afraid of persecution if they return. So, who could guess why this person was denied by the immigration officer when their claim is that they're scared of feeling afraid if they return? They're not saying that they will actually suffer persecution. They've ever had a real legitimate threat against them for being non binary in the United States. They are just saying that it is scary for them because they are afraid, which really just feels like they have bought into a lot of left-wing propaganda that they are at risk, and so they are scared because of propaganda that is not true. That's not real. That doesn't reflect reality. Again, J.D. Vance, Pam Bondi, Kash Patel, any other Trump official is not going to go after this person. All of the current laws do not put trans or non-binary people at risk. It basically, usually protects women's spaces. It tries to protect women's sports. It tries to have a real representation of somebody on official documentation. That on your birth certificate, on your passport, on your driver's license, it must say what you actually biologically are, because it's helpful information for like the police if they ever need to be able to find you for something and it says male when you're in fact female or female when you are in fact male. They're trying to get a good description of you, and that's not really self-representation is not helpful for them when they need it to be able to find a missing person or find someone who's a suspect for a crime. But moving on, they say they said more people should be paying attention to the erosion of trans and non binary people's rights in the US. Quote, I also fear not being able to travel to see my family, as most of my family lives in the South, which has already been deemed unsafe for transgender people to travel, and I know that no matter what I do, I look trans. People read me that way no matter the gender expression I portray, unquote. And this is going back to the Canadian government and other governments saying that you can't travel to Florida because Governor Ron DeSantis has passed legislation to stop the teaching of gender theory in classrooms, to keep biological men out of women's sports. Sensible stuff. You can now not travel to Miami Beach as a gay, trans, or non binary person because apparently in Miami Beach, it's all being run by the Ku Klux Klan or something like that. Obviously, I'm being facetious because those are cities well known for having significantly large gay populations, for having significant trans populations. Yes, you're unsafe in Miami Beach, Florida, in Miami in general. You, by the way, the South, there's a reason why they call it Southern hospitality. People in the South tend to be pretty easygoing and nice. I remember that there were actually studies a while ago that showed that in terms of racism, the South in the United States these days is the least racist place. It is the least likely place for someone to judge you based on what you were born as. But anyways, moving on once again in this article, Mix Jenkels said that they came out as gender fluid non binary to their friends and on social media in 2015 when they were 14 and to their mother a year later. Their gender marker was changed in the school system while in high school, and they took testosterone as a 15 and 16-year-old. However, their father objected to them taking hormones as a minor, and it was stopped abruptly. They started hormone therapy again at age 18. Well, good for the father. Good for the father for wanting to defend their child from taking life altering, body altering hormones when they were not an adult yet and really shouldn't be making that type of a decision. If this is being included as like the persecution that's going on in the South, that's patently absurd. Plus, this person doesn't live in the South. What's someone going to do to them? They're an adult. Or are they going to take them off hormones? They probably should stop doing them, but there's no actual risk to this person's life. There's no risk of, of physical harm, of harassment, nothing. And this person has drunk the Kool-Aid so much, they genuinely think they're at risk in a country where no one's going to touch them. The federal court noted that Mix Jenkels had fears about returning to an environment where they were previously where they previously experienced fear as a non-binary person. Again, even the federal court is pointing out this person is scared of being fearful. There's no actual risk. This person has taken in so much propaganda that they are fearful somewhere that they should not be fearful. It acknowledges that Mix Jenkels had caring responsibilities for their partner who has a medical condition that brings on seizures. Human rights advocates have been calling on Ottawa to provide a safe haven for gender diverse residents of the US after Mr. Trump signed an executive order saying a person's biological classification is immutable, which is true, it's their biology. And gender identity will no longer be acknowledged by the US. Really, they should say in this line, that just says by the US, they should say by the US government, because the whole point is that Trump is not saying that you are not allowed in the United States to just represent yourself however you want in casual interactions with other people. They're saying that again on your passport and birth certificate, you cannot say that you are one thing when you were in fact the other, because it kind of makes a difference when you're trying to put people into a prison, or when you're trying to decide whether or not somebody can compete in a sport, or when you're trying to get, again, a good description of someone who may be the victim or perpetrator of a crime and you need to find them. But again, going down here, Mr. Trump has also signed an executive order to prevent people assigned male at birth. Again, intellectual liberal publication says assigned male at birth from participating in women's or girls' sporting events, or from being sent to women's prisons. The US government now only recognizes two genders and has stopped issuing passports and identity cards with an X gender marker to transgender and non binary Americans, because it's not biologically accurate. And the US government is not in the business of affirmation. They are, in fact, in the business of cold bureaucracy, cold bureaucratic efficiency. They are trying to do things not to affirm you, but to accurately describe you, because they need that for official documents, or when they are deciding, again, what prison you're going to go into. But again, this is just the mindset of liberal publications, of the Toronto Star, of the Tyee, of the Globe and Mail, that the US is dangerous because it's not hyper progressive. Apparently, this person can also no longer travel to Alberta because Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is rightfully implementing a lot of the policies that have been implemented in the US, in favor of parental rights, against allowing men into women's sports, all stuff like that, which is apparently so scary that you can't even travel back to the US. So apparently, this person's at risk even within Canada. This person has to make sure to avoid ever visiting Calgary. Oh my goodness, we're almost done here. Mr. Trump has also abolished the US government's diversity, equity, and inclusion departments and has taken steps to exclude transgender people from the US military. Well, apparently now nobody who is diverse can go to the US because they don't have a federal DEI department. Canadian LGBTQ rights activist or advocate Gemma Hickey has heard from transgender Americans who have had their passports shredded or confiscated since Trump took office, and others who have been too afraid to renew their identity documents. Why? Why was it shredded? It's almost like the passport is now inaccurate. They have not had their passport seized, and like in Qatar, are not allowed to like leave the country. They just need to get a new passport within like a month that accurately portrays who they are. If anything, someone should be mad at the Biden administration for having given out documents with inaccurate information on them. But I digress. They said they were pleased that the judge has considered the impacts of Mr. Trump's edicts on trans and non binary people in her ruling on Mix Jenkel's case. Quote, I really applaud the move by the judge, and I think it's precedent setting, they said. Quote, there is so much chaos coming out of the White House, and I think it's on purpose. This ruling from the judge will force people to pause and reflect just how dangerous it is for marginalized people there. Sarah Mikhail, also from Smith Immigration Law in Toronto, said the judgment is, quote, a really exciting precedent to see. Quote, what we are seeing here is an important determination from the judiciary that this isn't business as usual, and what's happened in January with the inauguration and the change in administration has amounted to a difference in conditions to the safety posed to trans and non-binary individuals, and that there is led to a deterioration. Ms. Mikhail said, this this is an acknowledgement that these changes are serious and that this is something that has a material effect on trans and non-binary individuals. IRCC declined to comment as the matter is before the court. Yeah, I could see why the immigration department doesn't want to talk about this, because it's ridiculous. Even for the Canadian government, immigration department, even this is a little bit too silly to talk about. Again, this person is not at risk for going back to the United States. Not at all. But it just fits in to the Globe and Mail and progressive activists in Canada's narrative about the US. Their anti-American perspective is so deep. It's so deep-seated that even someone simply saying I'm scared is evidence enough that they should not even have to go back to the US. They are scared of being fearful, frankly, because trans activists spread so much propaganda negative about these common sense laws in the United States that people are irrationally scared. If anything, they are actually at risk of going back to the United States and being surrounded by activists telling them that they are at risk. This article from the Globe and Mail is perfectly in line with another one they actually recently published, which we can't talk about today, but it was arguing that Canada should make a closer relationship with China because we need to fight back against the United States. We need to resist the US. So let us run into the loving arms of the CCP who keep trying to rig our elections. This is the perspective of the Globe and Mail. They also have other reports showing that China's popularity on a global level in Canada is actually rising and America is falling. It's like why do you keep noting things about China that are positive? That seems a little odd. The Globe and Mail is famously a publication where if an article comes out posing some sort of liberal policy, it may actually just be coming from the liberal government wanting to kind of front run a decision that they may make. The Globe and Mail has also been publishing articles about maybe we should increase the GST from 5% to 7%. That's the Liberal Party wanting to see whether or not Canadians are going to react really badly to that, or they're willing to accept it because, well, we got to fight back against the US, so the Canadian government needs more revenue right now. But I think this is evidence that, yeah, the Liberal Party has not gone back to the middle. I can guarantee we are not going to see Liberal Prime Minister Mark Carney come out and disagree with this decision. He can be the guy who wants people to show up in time in his government and wear suits and ties and leather shoes. He can act more businessy on the outside, but him and his government is activist to its core. They are not going to disagree with this judge because how could you disagree with the first female judge appointed to a federal court position? How could they? And also, how could you disagree with a non binary person saying they are fearful going to the United States? You wonder why we're messing up the trade negotiations with the United States when our government keeps calling them bigots and putting trans people in danger. We keep trying to put in place digital services tax and carbon border adjustments, and then we freak out whenever the US doesn't seem to like us very much. And even Americans don't dislike Canadians. It's the government that is baffled by the decisions that our government and our institutions have been making. But I guess what can you do? This is the country that we currently live in, guys. Well, hopefully you've liked this first episode of my show that is yet to be named on Juno News. And again, a reminder to subscribe to the Juno News channel and also consider subscribing to the Juno News website for premium content behind the paywall. Anyways, that's it for me today, guys. See you all later.